that picture I showed you, that lobe-fin fish thrashing around in the dried out pond. That was somebody down here. Freshwater habitats are unpredictable and temporary, frequently. So a creature living in a freshwater system would be subject to what we call selective pressures of being forced to deal with land occasionally. And most fishes just die when that happens. But these lobe-fin fishes, again, they were already breathing with lungs. Lungs evolved way down here. And they had the lobe fins, which probably evolved. These were freshwater things living in swamps. They were probably resting on the bottom and then lurking around in weed-choked waters looking for prey. So lungs were already present, air breathing. Lobe fins, and those aren't for walking, but if your pond dries out and that's all you have, go ahead. And so somewhere in here, these creatures were being pushed up on land. Probably initially only in an emergency, their pond dries out. But there are resources on land. There's food up there. And think about this. Arthropods, insects and things like that, they were already up on land. They came up on land a long time ago. And they evolved on land. And as long as they'd been on land, they'd never met a predator. So if you went up on land and you're a carnivore, you're faced with a whole array of prey that had never experienced predation. So there's food up here. There's an escape from a drying habitat. There's escape from predators. Your water's filled with predators. If you can jump up on land, get away from a predator, even if you're just up there for a minute, that's a selective advantage. And so these things are becoming terrestrial in an emergency, and then later, occasionally doing it just to go searching for food. And we gradually became more and more terrestrial, until eventually we had terrestrial tetrapods who spent all or most of their life on land. And of anything alive today, that original creature would have been like something like an amphibian, a salamander, but about this big. Okay? So, somewhere in here, we transition to things we call tetrapods. Let's do it this way. And we'll look, I'm giving a review of what we're going to do in a minute. Somewhere in here, we transition to tetrapods. The tetrapod, diversified, huge diversity of them in the Devonian. Only 2 lineages managed to survive into modern times. And that's a lineage that went to amphibians. Okay, think frog. And then another lineage went to what we call amniotes. Amniotes are mammals and reptiles. We have 2 separate tetrapod survivors. And then there's all sorts of stuff that disappeared a long, long time ago. These are experiments, came up on land, didn't go anywhere. Okay? So that's kind of where we're at as we push on. So Friday 6 a.m. is kind of up to here. And well, think about it. If you have any questions, if any questions occur to you before the end of the day, think of them as you're reviewing for Friday. The first thing we'll do Friday is we'll review stuff if you want. So that's a new chapter. You're finding the PowerPoints on Blackboard? Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, you get a new PowerPoint. I love these paintings, if you haven't noticed. I'll move this over here so we can point to it. I'm doing below for extinct things. Okay. From fish to tetrapod and then fish to terrestrial tetrapod. And I'm going to say this a couple of times, but the first tetrapods were mostly aquatic. They came up on land in an emergency. So we get to a point where we've got tetrapods, and they're really aquatic creatures. They're really fish still. But they have the ability to come up on land in an emergency. And then eventually we get to a terrestrial tetrapod, and I define that as a creature that spends a significant portion of his life on land. Almost certainly goes back to water like a frog does, but that's a terrestrial animal. So there's one of the transitions here is from aquatic to terrestrial. So we go fish-like aquatic, semi-aquatic, semi-terrestrial, terrestrial. So we want to think again about terrestrial living and some of the challenges of terrestrial living, because we do them. We evolved. Our group of mammals have been living terrestrially for our whole existence, so it's just normal for us. But there are challenges that we face that a creature living in an aquatic system does not, and so there are adaptations or features that are needed for terrestrial living, and we can abandon some things we don't need that are only needed for aquatic living. So we want to give this some thought. I like salamanders. They're kind of cool, right? I grew up where you never saw them unless you went camping in the northern part of the state, so I always thought finding salamanders was great. There's one native salamander on campus, and I've only seen him once. So anyway, there's those ancient wetlands. Again, this is a freshwater transition, and we have aquatic living down here, we have semi-terrestrial living here, we have terrestrial living up here, and that's the world in which we think this happened. It's really cool. We got astracoderms, we got placoderms, we got low-fin fishes.
And some funny trees.
And some awesome trees, yeah, some funny trees. So one of the things that we talked about last time that becomes increasingly less of an issue is this osmotic balance business. When you're moving up on land, you're not exposing tissue, at least in part of your life cycle, to that environment. So you don't have that problem of water diffusing in or water diffusing out, or trying to keep salts in or water out. So these osmotic balance issues become less and less important until the time we get something like us. We as mammals don't worry about them at all. And aquatic things and some of those transitional things, we're certainly having to deal with these osmotic issues. If you look at an aquatic tetrapod, like a turtle, that guy's waterproof. He doesn't have those diffusion issues, water in, water out. So that's something we can turn our back on. One thing that's new for us is support, and creatures living in aquatic habitats are in an extremely supportive environment. Water is very dense, and the biggest creatures on the planet are aquatic creatures. That's just a bit of physics. Once you move up on land, you have to deal with gravity now in a very different way. And terrestrial creatures that are big are a lot different than aquatic creatures that are big. You need really massive bones to support that much weight. Wastes in respiration. Aquatic things are breathing with gills typically, or sometimes they're breathing with their skin, or they're breathing with lungs, but they're primarily breathing water. Water's heavy. Water doesn't have nearly as much oxygen in it as air does. There's lots of differences between aquatic breathing and terrestrial breathing, and among them are the structures involved. Terrestrial creatures, these vertebrates, transition to lung breathing exclusively almost. There's some amphibians that don't breathe with lungs, but most terrestrial vertebrates, most tetrapods, are using their lungs for breathing, and the other organs that fish breathe with disappear or become de-emphasized. Waste elimination for tetrapods, terrestrial tetrapods, is more of a challenge in certain ways. Fishes, go back to this guy here. a lot of the waste elimination in a fish is through the gills. As the blood flows through the gills, the waste products just diffuse into seawater or fresh water. They don't have complicated waste collecting and concentrating systems. They don't need them because they're swimming in a sewer, essentially. Terrestrial creatures have to take those wastes out of the blood and put them someplace and then eliminate them at an appropriate time. And so in terrestrial vertebrates, terrestrial tetrapods, our kidneys start picking up that function. In fishes, and we'll look at kidneys in lab when we look at our fish anatomy. Look at the kidneys. Kidneys in fishes are not big things. They're not involved much in waste elimination. They're mostly involved in salt and water balance. They become much more important in terrestrial tetrapods because they are now the focus of waste collection, detoxification, isolation, and then elimination. It's a more complex process because we're not swimming in a sewer anymore. And one side of that is we have those very toxic wastes that come out in your urine. As a mammal, you produce that urine. You have to use a significant amount of water to eliminate that poison. That becomes something we have to deal with. Our water rationing has to include waste elimination. So there's an evolutionary tree. Let's see, where am I going? Like I said, I rearranged this yesterday, so I have to remind myself the new way. So here's fishes. There's actinids, that's a word I haven't used. There's the coelacanths. There's the lungfishes. And here's the tetrapods. So we've got this thing here where we've got invertebrates, we've got fishes, and again the lower fishes are left off here, and we've got the tetrapods. And we want to spend a little bit of time now here. And this is all in the fossil record. There's no survivors of this era. And a new word was coined recently, fishopods, to describe creatures that are really pretty much aquatic. They're breathing with gills. They don't leave water unless you make them, maybe in an emergency. But they're able to deal with terrestrial habitats, at least for short periods of time, like in an emergency. And they're the transitional creatures, and that's not a technical word. It's just a cute word that a paleontologist came up with, fishopods. So, we in our story we have fishes, unquestioned fishes, gill-breathing, aquatic creatures would survive more than a few minutes outside water, to something in between, to something that can complete most of his life cycle on land. Okay, so again, and I already did some of this, but we're thinking about niche here again. There's the challenges of terrestrial living. That's up here, and we need adaptations to deal with that because we're aquatic creatures. We're down here, but there's certainly those challenges up there. But there's also problems down here. I call them perils. The perils of aquatic living. There were selective forces, and that's what I've used that phrase before, but selective force is a phrase that biologists use. It's selection coming at your population, promoting a certain direction. And so we had selective forces in these aquatic habitats saying, terrestrial living is not such a bad idea. I mean, there's a lot of predators down here in these habitats, for one thing. Lots of big things with mouths. Up on land, there's nothing yet. So, lots of predators in the water, lots of competition for food, competition for oxygen, competition for habitat, and predation. So, there's issues with living in water. And then there's this issue, which I think is a huge one. In these freshwater systems where we think this happened, this would be a regular event in your evolutionary life. A drought, or maybe just summertime. Your wetland dries out. And either you have to follow the water into the nearest river to survive summer, or maybe you can flop or crawl or drag yourself if the whole thing dries out. So there would have been forces promoting a semi-terrestrial lifestyle. And that's a great picture of what I just think that illustrates it so well. Here's our lobe-finned fish. That's a gill-breathing fish with lungs. And these are gill-breathing fish that are going to die. This guy might roll or drag himself to the nearest permanent water. And he gets to he gets to carry on his fitness. I like this cartoon. So, from fish to tetrapod to terrestrial tetrapod is the transition. And there's some of the players there in our story. We have unquestioned fish, we've got things in between, we've got unquestioned tetrapod, terrestrial tetrapod. All right. Okay, let me see where we're going with this. Okay. Let's look at some of the traits and put them on an evolutionary tree. So, lungs evolved way down here. We already have lungs. Lobe fins evolved down here. So those are two traits that are important for our terrestrial story. There's another one that shows up here, another trait, a synapomorphy, if you will, and it's called choanae. And here's a group of these fish-like things and tetrapods, and there's a bigger group called the choanada. Choanae is a fancy word meaning nostril. And starting here, we've got fishes. Now, we've talked about this. All fishes have nostrils on top of their snout, right? And remember when I was talking about fishes smelling? I said they can't do this. Because fishes don't have a connection from the nostril to the inside of the mouth. That's what internal nares are, or internal choanae. Internal nares, the nostril extends into the mouth. That's not a fish thing. That's a primitive tetrapod thing. And that's another cool adaptation that shows up when or where exactly, not clear, but it means that an animal like this, it's already breathing with its lungs. This animal could just stick its snout out of the water and do that. That may have been a big step forward, and it defines the tetrapods and one group of funny fish-like things, fish-like tetrapods. So, there's a choanae. It's a lobe-fin fish, subgroup choanada. We combine the internal nares with lung breathing, and like I just said, you can stick your snout out of the water and fill that lung with air. So, prototetrapods. Got a bunch of lines there. It's saying we got a lot of fossils. We're still trying to figure out how they're related to one another and how they are in the big picture there. But there's this diversity back in the Devonian of these creatures in these wetlands, these freshwater lobe-fin fishes with the choanae, the lobe fins breathing with lungs, and natural selection's coming at them. Ponds are drying out, filling with water. That's the scene we're seeing. Classic one we look at is a creature called Eusthenopteron. Again, if ever we're going to talk about Eusthenopteron on an exam, I would give you the word and say, Eusthenopteron is this thing, next thing, what does it tell you? A good question would not be, what's a primitive lobe-fin fish? Eusthenopteron would be one of the answers. But this is a classic one of these animals down here, this zone. A fish-like tetrapod. Shallow, freshwater creature, probably swamps and wetlands. The lobe fins are for dragging yourself through the weeds in water. The lung means you can breathe in that low oxygen water. But the lobe fins and the lung and the choanae also mean if that pond dries out, you could roll or drag yourself to the nearest permanent water. The Eusthenopteron is kind of our classic animal at this level of evolution, of an aquatic fish, but terrestrial in an emergency. And they were about this big. These were not small animals. So we make this transition from aquatic to semi-terrestrial to terrestrial. And that's going on down here in the Devonian. And if we had a vertebrate paleontology course, we might play with this, but that we don't need to do all the details here. The first thing is we're going to start calling tetrapods. And what defines tetrapod are limbs. And we'll look at some of these. Don't write these down. We're going to walk through these. But limbs, and instead of fin rays at the end of the limb, we're starting to see digits. Digits spread your weight out when you push them into the mud. Fin rays don't do that as well. So what we're seeing here when we start to define, yeah, you're a tetrapod now, we're starting to see, instead of fins, we're starting to see limbs. And if we look at this evolutionary tree here, this is a lungfish, a fossil lungfish. These other things are tetrapods. And they increasingly, the lobe fin is lengthened and strengthened into more of a limb. And what were fin rays for swimming disappear, and some of the wrist bones get fine and thin and become fingers or toes. And so we go from fins, we go from lobe fins with fin rays to stumpy limbs with fin rays, stumpy limbs with digits. And that's the transition. We start to see at the end of the day, we see digits on the end of the lobe fin, and we call those fins instead of, or we call them limbs instead of fins. This is useful on land. You know, we start going back here, these would just be out in an emergency, or maybe chasing a prey animal up on the muddy beach and then rolling back in, or jumping out to get away from a predator. These might work for that. This is going to work for running around. Well, not running, dragging yourself around. The limb girdles, that's the limbs. The limb girdles, we see a lot of modifications there. This is aquatic or transitional. And we've got the lobe fin, we start to see digits there, but the girdles, the thing that supports it, like your pectoral girdle, your pelvic girdle, fairly slightly constructed, like in a fish. So they're not supporting weight, they're just anchoring the fin. And then we start to see, as we go terrestrial, we start to see the limb girdles with a rigid connection to the spinal, the backbone, I say spinal cord, and these bones become more and more robust. These bones are about transferring the weight of the body to the ground, from the vertebral column down to the ground. This is not very efficient. This animal can drag himself around the mud. These animals could walk. There's all sorts of skull modifications we look for too. And some of the most important ones are the disappearance of bones associated with the gills. Remember, bony fishes have a gill cover. That's these bones back here. Well, by the time we get terrestrial, gills are not a thing anymore. And so the opercular bones disappear. And that's a good sign when you get a fossil that doesn't have opercular bones. And we're not talking about a gill-breathing thing anymore. We're talking about a pure lung-breathing thing. So fish, middle here, intermediate, Canthostegia is pretty terrestrial. So the initial tetrapods, like a Canthostegia, were aquatic. They were up on land in an emergency, or maybe to chase a prey animal, or maybe to jump out of the way of a predator. But these were aquatic creatures. And if we had one alive today, we'd put him in the fish side of a zoo, not in the amphibian side. And there's a fossil. There's a Canthostegia. There's a fossil, just so you get an idea what the fossils look like. This is a recent discovery. I don't know how to pronounce that, Tikwiak or something like that. This is from northern Canada. They found this on one of those frozen islands in northern Canada. And this is a really cool transitional fossil that showed up it was published about 10 years ago. And he's got a neat combination of characters that say, this guy is using land regularly, still an aquatic creature, but he's got some neat terrestrial traits. So a good example of that creature that probably is coming up on land to chase a prey item or to run away from a predator, but he's not up on land all the time. So we see a lot of reduction in the gills there, And we see, we don't have good fossils yet showing what the pelvic girdle is like. There's a really robust pectoral girdle there. And there's an artist rendering what that creature might have looked like. And there's the classic painting of him sticking his head out of water, looking for something to eat. You're not going to do a lot of walking with that, but it works. And remember, there's nobody else up here. There's no carnivores up here. There's no predators up here at all. Once you're out of the water, no one's chasing you. So there he is, grabbing the little guy off the beach. So that's an aquatic creature. We move and we see those things I'm talking about. We see the limbs more limb-like than lobe fin-like. We see reduction in the gill support structures. We see even more connection between the limb girdles and the vertebral column, and we're more terrestrially able. And Ichthyostes is a good example of that creature. We'll call him semi-terrestrial. Maybe up there sunning himself or getting away from a large predaceous fish. I just like these paintings, so I put another one in. And there's some of the fossils there. This is a great one because look, we've got the limb there. Okay. Well, enough meandering around. These guys, these primitive aquatic, semi-aquatic, semi-terrestrial tetrapods, these guys diversified in the Devonian, all sorts of them. And at some point back in the Devonian, we get a divergence and we get these guys, this is this thing down here, we get these guys going two ways. Oh, well, they probably went many, many ways. Only two ways have made it into modern times. So we get this crowd we call amniotes, and we find that word, I think, the first day, but let's review. Amniotes means reptiles and mammals and some extinct stuff. There's a crowd called lepospondals. We'll come back and talk about them later, but those are kind of proto-amniotes. So this was one route here. Lepospondals are these primitive amniotes or proto-amniotes, and then amniotes, reptiles and mammals, which we get to include birds and reptiles. So that's one way of going. And this was the more terrestrial way. We'll get to that next week. There you go. Proto-amniotes. There's a reconstruction of one there. And the primitive ones, that's a word you're going to run into in the book if you're using the book. That's lepospondal, and I'm not going to use it a whole lot. The other direction is towards the amphibians and their ancestors. And these guys stayed much more aquatic than the amniotes. They didn't acquire a lot of super cool terrestrial adaptations. So the proto-amphibians, which are all extinct, they're a crowd called temnospondals. That's another word I'm not going to use more than a few more times. But those are the proto-amphibians, temnospondals. Spondle means spool, right? Can you picture like a spool on a thread goes on a spool? What part of your body looks like a spool? What bone do you have that is cylindrical? And a lot of them in a row. When you see the word spondle in one of these fossil biology words, think backbone. It's referring to the vertebrae. And so temnospondals would be these early proto-amphibians. We don't have anybody alive. None of these guys survived in modern times. So, that's our major diverse. We pretty much finished with this transition here. These cool things in those swamps. And now we want to focus on this stuff. And we're going to go, gotta watch the clock. We want to do amphibians today. So I made this summary of this transition. And it's one of those things to download and move your finger around it. But here's the summary. So we've got some divisions here. We got fish tetrapod, and then aquatic terrestrial. Because remember, there were the first tetrapods were aquatic. And then we go aquatic to terrestrial. So there's unquestioned. That's Eusthenopteron. That's a lobe-fin fish. And one of those guys gave rise to the tetrapods. and the early tetrapods. And these little arrows represent all sorts of lineage. This is a diverse group in water. These were aquatic guys in these freshwater habitats. And probably all sorts of different lineages of them experiment with living on land. Like I keep saying, in an emergency, or maybe just opportunistically reaching up and grabbing something. So there were probably lots of them back in the Devonian, lots of different lineages experimenting with terrestrial living. Only 2 survived. Only 2 got out of the Devonian. These are all dead ends. And one of those groups we call lepispondals, and it talks about the structure of their vertebrae. And another group is called temnospondals. Again, talking about the structure of their vertebrae. Details that aren't that important to us here. This is where we're headed today. The temnospondals diversified in the Devonian and the Carboniferous, and all sorts of dead ends. There's a big group of creatures, aquatic and semi-terrestrial and terrestrial. And the only survivors are a small group that squeaked into modern times, and these are what we call the amphibians. And the fancy biology word is lissamphibia. It's another word I'm not going to use much, but it's on the slides, and it's in the book. But lissamphibia just means amphibian in the way we use it today, frogs and salamanders. And then this lepispondal group, again, all sorts of dead ends, and then on to the things we call amniotes. The ancestor of the amniotes is down here. That's the thing that gave rise to reptiles and mammals, 2 important lineages there. So that's my attempt to summarize what I just said. We good? It's right here. Okay. So as we go this route, which is next week, we see adaptations for better terrestrial living. We are much better at terrestrial living than amphibians, right? This route, these guys never really went fully terrestrial. Yeah, frogs are terrestrial, but frogs have to hop back to water to lay their eggs. So amphibians are kind of a peek back into this era here. That's how I look at it. They're terrestrial, but they're really representing that early phase of terrestrial existence. Whereas amniotes, we took it the next step. Okay. There are lots of cartoons about this. Let's just put time on this picture. Time, I'm not a paleontologist, so I look at this geologic time in kind of big picture, like, the big patterns, like, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, and the finer stuff we'll leave. Anyone had geology? Some of you, okay. So these words maybe mean more to you than they do to me. So there's the timeline for life on our planet, and this goes back about 4 or 5 billion years, and we're not interested in any of this stuff here because it's way before anything we're interested in. It's only the last 10% really that we're interested in. That's the last 600 million years of a 5 billion year clock. So it's this last 10% that's expanded out here. So can you see what we're doing here? We're just going to focus on this. The first animals show up 700-800 million years ago. First vertebrates about 500 million years ago. So this is what we're focusing on. It's very, very chauvinistic of us. So anyway, forget the other stuff. There we go. So last 570 million years, we have these eras: Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic, and the times are here. I never remember any stuff. We don't worry about that. I just want us to know what's before or after, whatever. It's relative I'm interested in. The Paleozoic comes before the Mesozoic. Cenozoic is most recent, but the exact times, don't spend time worrying about that. Paleozoic means old animals. Mesozoic means middle animals. Cenozoic means new mammals. And these are the phases on our planet. There's the Paleozoic, and I put little green arrows there by the main fish events. And so earliest vertebrates go way back, maybe 530 million years ago, way back in the Cambrian. And into the Ordovician and Silurian, fishes start to radiate. And This is those, the Ordovician would be all those ostracoderms, the ones without jaws. The conodonts would have flourished in here. Jawed fishes show up in the Silurian. We've got an acanthodian there. Bony fishes, true bony fishes show up in the Devonian. Okay? So these were kind of the age of fishes. And then the Devonian is when a lot of stuff was happening and transitioning in the Carboniferous. And look at the name of this let's see, these are eras, these are periods. The Carboniferous. The Devonian and the Carboniferous were characterized by the earth covered, very mild climate. The earth was covered in rainforests. There's great habitat for fishes. And later, these early fishopods and amphibians. That's this phase in here. So here's the early tetrapods. Kind of towards the end of the era of fishes in the Devonian, we get those tetrapods diversifying the Devonian, and they start to come up on land. And again, this is an era of rainforests. So if you're a creature that's barely out of the water, this is your time. It's wet, the climate's mild, it's just set up for you. The climate's just right for you. I put quotes around amphibians right there because we don't call these early tetrapods amphibians if we're trying to be technical. Amphibians come much later. But what that means here, radiation amphibians, that's this zone here, that's early tetrapods. That's a Carboniferous thing. So again, the world's covered in rainforests. Finally, in the Paleozoic, so we transition from the Carboniferous to the Permian. We get amniotes. These are true terrestrial tetrapods, and particularly in the Permian, the amniotes take over, and things we call amphibians with quotes around it, these are highly diminished. We had a really ferocious climate change event right here. We went from a world of rainforests and swamps to a much drier, cooler planet. So, I like these. I just put this in here mostly to remind ourselves that the planet we look at today is not the planet of the Paleozoic. The climate was different. The positions of continents and oceans are quite different in those earlier times. And then you want to truly understand that, you have to keep that in mind. So, Ordovician. This is when fish is diversifying. So most life is aquatic still. Plants are starting to come up on land. We don't have particularly complicated terrestrial habitats yet. So most life is down here, back here in the Ordovician. Fishes are diversifying. So we move into the Devonian. These are people's idea what the Devonian looked like. We did the Ordovician here, later in the Devonian. The terrestrial habitats become more complex. Plants have moved up on land. Invertebrates have moved up on land. And for millions and millions of years, invertebrates and plants lived alone up here. And it's thought that all the early invertebrates were detritivores. They were eating dead plants and dead fungus. They didn't start grazing on living things for quite a while. But these habitats were just for plants and inverts. As we move from the Devonian into the Carboniferous, we're getting the earliest tetrapods in the Devonian, and they're starting to come up on land. And this is that era of rainforest. That's just great if you're a semi-aquatic, semi-terrestrial creature. That's your zone, a rainforest. It's always damp, so even so you don't have particularly good water conserving or water protecting mechanisms, you don't need them if you're crawling around in a rainforest. And by the way, these are when our great coal beds were laid down in the Carboniferous. So when you're burning coal, when you're digging coal, those are Carboniferous rainforests from 300 million years ago. And I like to emphasize that again and again. When we burn coal, we are importing carbon dioxide that was pulled out of the atmosphere in the Carboniferous, been sitting in the ground as coal for 300 million years. We take that carbon dioxide and we put it in the air of today. And that's the foundation of climate change or global warming. We're importing a pollution from a different time on our planet. So, Ordovician, Devonian, Carboniferous. Tetrapods are vertebrates diversify. They diversify. You get the first tetrapods. The tetrapods start experimenting with land. I just think this is a great slide. Some of the earliest terrestrial animals were thought to be millipedes, and that's a millipede trackway. We had these Devonian millipedes that are bigger. Can you picture millipedes in your backyard? Imagine a millipede 2 meters long. That's what these things were thought to have been. That's a trackway of them. That's just really, really cool. I think I talked about this last time. If you went back to the Devonian and stepped out of a time machine, 35% oxygen in the atmosphere. We're now at like 22% oxygen. That's so much oxygen in the atmosphere, you would faint if you stepped out. It's like you're hyperventilating until you faint. And so we could support really large terrestrial animals where there's so much oxygen in the atmosphere. This is my other favorite. I saw one of these fossils when I was doing research in Paris. I wandered over to the paleo place. We had dragonflies back there with wingspans of 75 centimeters. Okay, that's a meter, right? Yeah, that's 75 centimeters. That's a dragonfly with wings this big. That was a really impressive animal. And that could not survive today. There's not enough oxygen in the atmosphere to support an animal that big. An animal that breathes like that. That's big. But anyway, we're off topic. Oh, but this is the kind of stuff that those early tetrapods would be coming up out of the water. And this guy had never seen a predator. This guy had never seen a predator, didn't know what to do, didn't know how to handle it. So following on, I need a time scale. I should put one on there. So after the Carboniferous, the last period of the Paleozoic is the Permian. In the Permian, we have a big climate change event. As we transition from the Carboniferous to the Permian, I can note to myself I need a time scale there. We go through a big climate change event, and the world becomes cooler and drier. The rainforests disappear and are replaced by forests, and the weather's just cooler. And so it became a very different environment. Big climate change event, and it's thought to have been related to an enormous span of volcanic eruptions in what's now Siberia, called the Siberian Traps. It's a huge expanse of ancient volcanic activity. And when these things got going, probably for tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands or millions of years, they put so much debris in the atmosphere that they changed the climate. And we went from a world of rainforests to a much cooler and drier world. And so a lot of the creatures that had evolved for this rainforest way of life, all those proto-terrestrial tetrapods, they kind of lost their habitat. And we had creatures come out of that were better adapted for terrestrial living. So, in fact, it almost all ends here. We had a huge extinction event. So, aquatic diversification, early terrestrial diversification, and then the Permian promotes better terrestrial living. So these are some of those Devonian tetrapods. There's Ichthyostage, I can't see, that's that one I can't pronounce. These were mostly aquatic. And that habitat was well suited for them. Here's the Carboniferous, that's that arid rainforest, and these are some of these early tetrapods that thrived in the Carboniferous. And these are things, again, in and out of water, but even when they're out of water, they're in a rainforest, so it's a nice damp habitat. The Permian puts an end to the rainforest habitat, a large place of the habitat, and favors creatures that are better able to deal with terrestrial living. And we transition from these aquatic and semi-aquatic and semi-terrestrial things to truly terrestrial things. And this is when amniotes take off. Our foundation as amniotes here, that's the Permian. And this stuff down here, this stuff is a little less able to deal with terrestrial living. This stuff disappears, and our living amphibians are the pathetic remnants that survived. The Permian set the stage there. Okay, let's see how to do that. I'm going to get a drink.